Last Thursday, I taught a business school class. It was fun. It was a seminar of MBA students at Notre Dame. They were in South Bend in their classroom or on Zoom, and I was at my desk in Evanston on my day off. The class was the spirituality of leadership. The professor is a remarkable human, my friend Joe Holt, who is a lawyer and former Jesuit priest, and now teaching professor of business ethics at Notre Dame's Mendoza School of Business. Joe invited me to join him in teaching as he was bringing to his class Abraham Joshua Heschel's famous text, The Sabbath. He wanted to raise the idea of the Sabbath to his students, many of whom are practicing Catholics who mark their own Sabbath. I taught Heschel's concept of a palace in time, that Shabbat is, in Heschel's words, just that, a beautiful place set apart in place and time. That is what we Jews call holy, or kadosh. Our conversation included other pieces of Jewish text, including the Micah text that graces our large sanctuary wall. You know, those words in Hebrew that people tend to ask us, the rabbis in Cantor, about, what does that mean again? Micah, the words from Micah say, "It has been told you, people, and what God demands of you, to do justice, to love kindness, to walk humbly with your God." And then the class moved on to that small but mighty verse in Leviticus, "V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha," love your neighbor as yourself. We find this verse, it's actually the second half of a verse, almost buried in the text, in Leviticus 19, in this week's Torah portion, Kedoshim. It's almost an afterthought the way it's there. But consider that verse, love your neighbor as yourself, with those words. Consider its presence and impact throughout world history, its prominence in our own Jewish tradition and beyond. This commandment that is said to be the heart of the Torah for us is known to many in Christian faiths as the Golden Rule, and in the broader world as well, and has a place in many of the world's faith traditions. So the class got me thinking, and I've continued a conversation from that class this week as I've explored what it means to love your neighbor as yourself in dialogue with my dear friend, Professor Holt. I wanted to explore how we Jews view it. I mean, I knew, but I wanted to study the text. And I wanted to look at how that is similar to or different from his tradition. Did you know that this commandment was called or dubbed the Golden Rule in the 17th century by Anglican preachers? The instruction is linked to Jesus in his famous Sermon on the Mount, which is cited in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. The Christian take on this commandment is that your neighbor, or like, who is your neighbor, you might say, your neighbor is the one in need. That is clearest, I've learned, in the parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke, and also in the last judgment scene in Matthew, in which the criteria for judgment are sensitivity and responsiveness to those in need. In other words, I was hungry and you gave me food, thirsty and you gave me drink. Thus, in the Christian tradition, loving your neighbor is about action, not simply one of belief or emotion. Sounds familiar. For indeed, this is similar to our Jewish understanding of this important mitzvah. Love is linked to God for sure, right? Think about v'ahavta. Love Adonai your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might, to quote an earlier translation of that in the Union Prayer Books. Loving God in our tradition is demonstrated by how we act in the world. Think of v'ahavta. Love the Lord your God, love Adonai your God. And how do we do that? We teach our children, we put a mezuzah on our doorposts, we pray the words, and the list goes on. So the mitzvah to love our neighbor as ourself, commentators say, is about action, not emotion, from a Jewish vantage too. We see this a little bit later in this week's portion too, when our Israelite ancestors are commanded to love the foreigner in their midst. This implies merciful and kind action. Action, there's our key word. And as one contemporary commentator parses this verse, love for our neighbor is different from loving our family. It's not that overflowing of feeling, but it still implies action and intent. You shall love your neighbor as yourself, it is written, means that we must respect our neighbor's right to the same good fortune, the same privileges, and the same joys that we desire for ourselves. When we do this, hatred, prejudice, exploitation, and war will finally vanish from the human experience. Powerful words. Do we do it? Jewish commentators throughout the ages, we see some timeless words coming from centuries ago. If we look to the 12th century in Ibn Ezra, we learn that his thoughts, one should love that which is good for one's neighbor just as one loves it for themselves. And the 16th century commentator Sforno says that we should apply the same yardstick, the same measuring tool to our concern for our fellow, for others, that we would want applied to ourselves if we were in their shoes, in similar situations. Sforno and Ibn Ezra's instructions are powerful in this week in our nation, powerful always, but certainly as we reflect on what is justice and how we need to not only think about justice, but to act to make justice the norm and make injustice disappear. And us to think about more than our family and more than the people who look like us or believe what we believe. They challenge us to ask ourselves, how do I love my neighbor? How do I apply, or do I apply the same measure of concern to my neighbor that I apply to myself? Do I? Another way to think about this simple and so such a powerful mitzvah is to consider the two ways it's presented in our Jewish text. First, what we've been discussing, the positive way, what to do. Love your neighbor as yourself. This is about how we treat others, and it stems from teachings back in Genesis. You may recall that we are all created in God's image, and we're all descended from Adam, from the first human. Our rabbis throughout the ages have said this is very clear. This means that if we're all created in God's image, and we're all descended from one person, we're all there on an equal footing. No one can claim my yichus or my lineage is better than yours. And then there's the other side, the flip side. What should we not do? To illustrate this, I share with you a powerful story from Talmud, which I'm sure many of you have heard. A man came before our teachers Hillel and Shammai. First he came to Shammai, and he said, "Convert me on the condition that you teach me the entire Torah while I stand on one foot." Chutzpah, right? Shammai pushes him away with his builder's cubit, his measuring stick, a common tool of the time. He says, "Go away." So the same man came before Hillel. Hillel converted him and said, "That which is hateful to you, do not do to another." That is the entire Torah. And the rest is interpretation. Go and study. So he to consider what not to do. Depending on the instance or situation, considering what not to do may actually be more helpful in guiding our actions. What we shouldn't do. Don't do this. Don't sit idly by and watch others do things that you don't like. Don't do that which you find hateful. Don't do that which you wouldn't want brought on yourself. This wisdom from a sage of centuries ago, in the 13th century, a commentator named Chizkuni explains, you are to put yourself mentally into the position of your fellow human being, and therefore not do anything to him that you would not have others do to you. Think about that. Put yourself in someone else's mind. Now, we know we can't totally do that. We can't read people's minds, nor do we want to speak for them. But we can try. We can think about what we wouldn't want to be brought on to us. It makes you think. Those nuances are powerfully clear. Put yourself in someone else's shoes. Act toward others in ways that you would want them to act toward you. And don't act toward others in ways that you would find abhorrent, ones that you would find upsetting, hurtful, and so on. And so while indeed we cannot read others' minds or predict others' thoughts, Jewish tradition tells us to apply that same yardstick of concern to others. Use the same measuring stick for others that we would apply to ourselves. Now think about that image of a yardstick. I find it really powerful. In this week's Torah portion, we're actually told that we should keep honest weights and measures. That's a clear commandment if you work in things of heft. If you have a scale for potatoes or for building materials or for some other thing that you've made or you're selling, don't have a scale that's illegal, that's dishonest. But what about the stuff that doesn't have physical heft, that which has spiritual and ethical heft? We have to have honest, fair measuring tools there too. Do we? Do we have fair and honest measuring tools for compassion, for justice? That is, do we apply the same measures for compassion, for justice to others that we have for ourselves? Do we put ourselves in the shoes of another? These questions call us into account, and they call us into self-reflection in a week in which our nation is called to do the same. Called into account, called into self-reflection. In a week in which the Torah commands us very clearly, be holy. What is that? Isn't that God? Rabbi Morris Adler wrote some decades ago, holiness is not a special career. It's what we do with our careers, our lives, our opportunities, whatever and wherever we are. He writes that the holy life is not for the recluse and the hermit, but for every person. A holy life is not to be lived in some remote shrine, but in the midst of community, among other people. Taking our daily relations and the work we're called upon to do and treating them with priestly dignity. Carrying out with reverence a high sense of social responsibility. Whoever you are, whatever you do, whatever your background, be holy. Be holy in your family life. Be holy as a neighbor. Be holy as a citizen. What is Rabbi Adler saying? We should lift up everything we do to a high level. The highest level we can take on. For as we do that, that brings us closer to holiness, to God's very high standard. And that commandment to love, as in love your neighbor as yourself, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs explains, Judaism is a religion of love. Well, we know this. You shall love the Lord your God. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. You shall love the stranger. But he reminds us that we also have a religion of justice. For without justice, love corrupts. And who wouldn't bend the rules if not for someone that they love? And it is also a religion, our religion of compassion. For without compassion, law itself can generate inequity. Justice, Sachs says, plus compassion equals tzedek, the first precondition to a decent society. This Shabbat, we reflect on what it means to have a decent society. Let us reflect. Let us search our souls. I invite you to join in conversation with others, with me, with your neighbors of all faiths, with someone you believe thinks differently from you. What does it mean to love your neighbor as yourself? Share your understanding and listen to theirs. Aspire to holiness and act. Shabbat Shalom.